Hub. And briefly, the Global Shapers organization is a young professional global network of the World Economic Forum. We work on local social impact projects with a global lens, so we're connected globally with 500 or so other city-based hubs in over 150 countries. So I am joined today by several of my shapers, Courtney Kishba, who will be moderating and doing tech backup for us today, and Jonathan Steirer, who is the operations manager at the SDLE Center at Case Western Reserve University and will be facilitating our discussion today. I did want to briefly mention that if you want to learn more about Global Shapers Cleveland, what we do, if you'd like to apply to join our hub, you'd like to work with us, Courtney will be posting in the chat our link tree, which links all of our social media. So we're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and all of the future Shaping the Future conversations will continue to be on Eventbrite. So as we continue to have different topics in the climate change and environmental justice space, we'll be posting them there. And did want to take the time to briefly thank our fiscal sponsor and advisory partner, Black Environmental Leaders, as well as FreshWater Cleveland for supporting this joint media campaign. So with that, I will give it to John and stop sharing my screen here so we can introduce the panelists.
Great, thanks, Elena. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to our panelists for being here today. I'm going to hand introductions off to the panelists to start. So if you all could give a quick introduction to who you are, your organization, and how it relates to transportation, and then we will go from there. But just a quick 1-2 minute introduction for everybody, and we can start. I'll go through kind of clockwise on my screen. Rap, do you want to start?
Yes, I'm Rap Hankins. I live in the city of Trotwood, Ohio. I'm the Vice President of Racial Equity and Dealer Relations for Drive Electric Dayton. And I'm also the Chairman of Racial Equity for the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission. And as it relates to transportation, where I came into this space 3 years ago in Trotwood in the Miami Valley, we had 3 level 5 tornadoes that could come through the community and destroy Trotwood, which is the largest African-American community in Southwest Ohio. And when it came to a question of energy, I went out and bought a gas generator and realized how noisy it was. And then went out and started looking at batteries and actually ended up with one of the first EVs in my community. And when after I bought a charger and started charging at home, I looked around a city of 24,000 people on 30 square miles and realized we did not have one EV charger in our community. So in the last year, I've been working very, very hard on changing that and putting at least planning to put level 2 chargers all over our community. And our motto is EVs for all, because we believe that what first comes first is the infrastructure, then comes the cars. And we need to look at EVs if we're going to really make a difference in underserved communities. And I'm glad to be here.
Great, thank you. Next on my screen is Mandy Metcalf.
Hi, I'm Mandy Metcalf. I'm a senior planner at RTA, and I'm in the programming and planning department, which is essentially our capital planning and long range planning department. So we work on long range strategic planning, TOD planning, environmental review, shelters and transit waiting environments, planning for BRTs, and that sort of thing. And I have a planning and environmental science background. Before I came to RTA, I worked for Environmental Health Watch on affordable green housing. And I also did a stint as the Eco Village coordinator for Detroit Shoreway, and that's a project and a community around the West 65th Street Rapid Station. I'm also a longtime transit rider, and I just started commuting with my 7-year-old on the RTA bus to his school. So that's been an interesting experience as well. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Alex Rubin.
Good evening, thanks for having me. I'm Alex, I live in Cleveland Heights. I've worked in public transit for the last 7 years, both in the public sector and private sector. I'm the treasurer of Clevelanders for Public Transit, and I've been volunteering in the public transit as well as the pedestrian and bicycle lane advocacy world for over a decade. I am excited to be here and to sort of talk about what we can do to build transit back up in Greater Cleveland and how that relates to climate change.
Great, thank you. And then finally, but not least, Beth Glas.
Hello, I am Beth Glas, the Executive Vice President at Maximum Accessible Housing of Ohio. We're a Cleveland nonprofit that advances accessibility, inclusion, and independence in homes and communities. I've worked here for 15 years. I am director of our Anderson Center program, which conducts trainings and advocacy around accessible housing and inclusive public spaces. I'm also co-chair of ADA Cleveland and on the Cuyahoga County Advisory Committee on Persons with Disabilities. Transportation is a really interesting topic within the disability community. There's lots of layers and meaning. So transportation for people with disabilities, but also thinking about all those caregivers and aides and providers, their transportation and access as well. Most people with disabilities don't own their own vehicles, and there's a really strong reliance on pedestrian travel and public transit as well.
Great, thank you. So one note for some people that are joining, please just feel free to drop questions in the comments. We can get to those right away. If you prefer to raise your hand, that works as well, and then we can call on you. Just keep yourself muted until then. But I would like to kick off the discussion, and I appreciate those introductions because I think they relate a lot to this. First one is, so some of you have really touched on this already, I think, which is generally like high level. What does the future of transportation look like to you? And that can be interpreted in a couple ways. I'd love to see what your thoughts are on that, both maybe on a local context, but then maybe larger. So like on a national scale. Or something beyond the local context. What do you foresee as the future of transportation? And if anybody would like to go first, feel free. But if not,
I'll start if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would like to talk about the present and the future. I think it's very important that many times when we talk about transportation, we have a dream that transportation is going to be dealing with buses and people actually moving in large numbers in large vehicles and getting out of our cars. And I would tell you that in looking at the African-American community in Southwest Ohio, I'm really not seeing that. I'm finding that because of redlining and housing, many times underserved communities see their cars as their most important investment. And people really tie their self-worth and identity to their cars. And 70% of the pollution that we're seeing in the United States today is coming from single vehicles. So my vision really for the present and the future is the importance of moving people out of gas cars and moving them to electric vehicles. And I think that that's really essential. And one of the problems that we're having today is that when most people look at electric cars, they're thinking about things like Teslas, where people are spending $60,000 and $70,000. And many times that cost may not be expensive for everyone who's in an underserved community, but it leaves many people out. So first and foremost, as I said earlier, it's really important that we utilize money that's coming from the federal government in the next several years to put level 2 chargers, which are chargers that basically generate 40 miles an hour, and level 3 chargers that generate literally up to 200 or 300 miles in 20 minutes throughout underserved communities, and bring the price of EVs down where everybody can afford them. Because I think the planet can't wait any longer. We see with all the things that are going on that we've got to get people out of gas cars and into EVs. And I think that once people see the benefit. We say that once you put your butt in an electric car, you don't want to get out. So I actually see the future of us moving away from gas automobiles into EVs, and then combining that with mass transit, which in the state of Ohio is actually rather weak. The federal government just announced a couple of weeks ago that they're willing to provide to any school 25 electric buses and chargers for free. And where in Michigan and other places, we've seen people really apply for those government grants. We've not seen that in Ohio. So I really think that we need to see local elected officials and citizens understand the importance of moving to electric vehicle, electric buses, electric trucks. And we can't let EVs be the next redlining event in Ohio, where underserved communities are the last people to take advantage of the importance of electrification of the great state of Ohio.
Thank you for that. I think the transit funding point, I think, is really critical, like with the Ohio context. And I think both Mandy and Alex could probably provide a lot of input on that front. I know, but relating that kind of the funding and the resource side of investment to kind of the point you made earlier, Rap, about how building infrastructure first and then adoption following infrastructure. And I think that the infrastructure point relates in a lot of ways to some of the challenges of urban transit systems as well. So if I could hand it off to Mandy, maybe for comment next. I think there's a couple maybe points there that relate nicely to your expertise, Mandy.
Okay, so starting, I guess, with the infrastructure piece and the funding. So we are seeing a lot of funding opportunities for transitioning to the zero emission buses, both for the charging infrastructure that's needed and also the buses themselves. It's a big challenge to get there. There's a lot of challenges still there. And it's a sort of separate infrastructure from all of the related funding and infrastructure that's being rolled out across the state for private vehicles. So RTA has created both a climate change plan and a zero emissions plan. And in our climate change plan, we are aligning ourselves both with the Biden administration's overall goals of 50% reduction by 2030 and zero emissions by 2050, and also really taking a very realistic perspective about what we can actually accomplish. So, we're looking at reducing emissions from 2018 levels by 30% in our fleet through transitioning first to CNG and then eventually getting to electric buses and getting to zero emissions by 2050 is an aspirational goal. And that starts with doing a pilot project to do an electric bus pilot first. But I will also say that we also have in the climate change plan, we have strategies that center around mode shift and ridership as well, because that's an important part of it. And my personal vision for the future of transportation really starts with that. I see frequent transit connecting neighborhoods in the urban environment where you can walk and bike, and car use is reduced, not eliminated, but reduced. So we have zero emission vehicles and we have zero emission buses ultimately, but the first climate change strategy that really can produce benefits quickly, not only for climate, but also so many other co-benefits, is mode shift away from cars, right? So we need to think about that also, because that gets us not only climate benefits, but safer roads, better health outcomes, lower air pollution through shifting riders onto transit, and more affordable access to jobs and education and all the things that people need. as well as opportunities for investment around transit in the city and underdeveloped and previously redlined communities. So, and we've put all that in our plan. It's a lot. There are a lot of challenges, but I think we can get there.
Thank you, Mandy. I'm curious, Beth, for some of your thoughts on this, especially because I think where you sit in the organization, you probably have a lot of insight into the challenges of certain stakeholders you work with in rural and suburban communities as well as urban, where I feel like the transportation access challenges are probably vastly different. So I would love to hear any comments that have popped into your head so far, but also kind of generally what your view of the future of transportation looks like.
Sure. So that's a lot of things to address.
I know, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I definitely think just in general, in terms of the future, more local safety, like more sidewalk safety, pedestrian travel safety, spaces that are wide and flat and well lit, with free of barriers, with benches and more options. And it's interesting to think about suburban and rural communities as well, because usually the urban communities are where we see the sidewalks. Regardless of condition, you generally do have sidewalks, where in especially rural communities, but often suburban communities as well, sidewalks are a lot more rare. And then access to goods and services is also generally does require vehicular transportation. And the problem, of course, when talking about disability is the lack of accessible vehicles in spaces that don't have appropriate public transit. Your access to like paratransit services is really limited. And so it often becomes a community effort to bring people around. And again, if you're talking about people who use wheelchairs, wheelchair equipped vehicles are extremely expensive. The wheelchairs themselves are really expensive. So transportation of them is, it has to be safe and it has to be reliable, particularly with power wheelchairs. So options can be really limited. So a lot of people do find themselves more and more isolated in rural and suburban communities. So, I think it would be great thinking about electric vehicles and the fleet. So often it's retrofitting of vehicles to make them more accessible and make them more usable, whether it's talking about, making it fully wheelchair accessible, or thinking about even things like just changing joysticks and changing the equipment for somebody who maybe only has one arm or has, a different disability, that they don't need the wheelchair access. So it's always retrofitting. I believe it was only within the last 5 years that a vehicle was designed from the start to be wheelchair accessible. So when thinking about, building new fleets of vehicles with different sustainable options, thinking about incorporating that from the beginning, I think would be really helpful. There's so many areas, like things like ride shares, that people with disabilities cannot participate in because there aren't the vehicles for them, or the businesses aren't equipped for managing accessibility. Drivers don't know, aren't used to speaking with people with disabilities. There's no training on ableism and attitudes, when and how to touch someone's wheelchair. And then it's being more complicated because RTA is under the purview of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The individual drivers on Lyft, Uber, they're not. And so that creates a lot of customer service issues, safety issues, and it's really keeping people with disabilities from having all the same options to participate in their communities affordably as well. So I think there's a lot of room to grow and a lot of space to make those changes. It's just a matter of wanting to make those changes.
Yeah, that's a lot of good points there. Thank you for that. And then Alex, I hand it off to you.
Thank you. So to pull it back to the question of the future of transportation, last year, Clevelanders for Public Transit published our policy platform called Ending the Transit Death Spiral, a Positive Vision for Public Transit in Greater Cleveland. And so right at the top of that document, which you can find on our website, clevefortransit.org, we lay out our vision of a possible future for Cleveland for public transit here. And that includes, frequent routes, shelters at every bus stop, real-time countdown clocks and other displays at your bus stop, and, all-door boarding and proof of payment checked by transit ambassadors, and all, speeding up trips and just making transit a more attractive option, making it something that people in Cleveland are going to be drawn to because it really is something that works in their life. As far as the question of what will the future of transportation look like, that's a decision that we have to make. And I think it boils down to, are we satisfied with the status quo or not? Status quo of car-dominated society, and a society where people see their car as a lifeline because their car is a lifeline. We've built communities where you can't get to a job or to see your friends or to go shopping or do anything if you don't have a car. And swapping the entire fleet of private vehicles from gas powered to battery powered will not change that. It will have cleaner air, but we'll have the same problems that we've always had with car-dominated world. We'll have parking lot deserts all throughout downtown. We'll have traffic heading into all of our big cities. We'll have a monumental amount of traffic deaths and injuries, the leading cause of death for young people in this country. This is the world we've built, and we can continue down that road just with the different technology that's driving these cars. Electric vehicles are the exact same size as internal combustion engine cars. We will need just as much space to store them in parking lots. And so we need to ask ourselves, do we like the world that we've built? And I personally do not. And I think that the world that we need to create is one where we incentivize the most efficient use of space in our cities. Cities are a treasure, and people are voting with their feet and they're moving to cities. This is a clear pattern we see all across the world. And there's something about living in a city that people want. And the more space that we use in our cities for storing cars, the more expensive they are, the less people that we can house there, and it's just the less livable a city becomes. So this is the kind of path that I would like to see that we turn away from. And in the city especially, we need to really be conscious of all of the decisions that are made every day in the halls of power that are keeping us on this track of car choked streets and children being run over, and a rickety, dying transit system.
All right, thank you for that input. I want to build on a couple points you made and actually go back to Rap quickly, because I think you both made there's a really similar point I think you both made about sort of the structural way in which certain transportation needs have been constructed in our society. And Alex, you made the point about access to jobs, the points about access to other resources like stores, and Beth touched on that as well, about accessibility, especially in less dense communities, and structurally just how that impacts people, and how certain forms of transportation serve as a lifeline, varying populations being able to access those, to different degrees, depending on whether they're, like fully able-bodied or they need a modified vehicle that doesn't exist. But I think, Rap, you made the point about how in a lot of, formerly redlined communities, which are still really functionally redlined communities, personal vehicles serve as both that lifeline for people, but also, I think you kind of got to the point where there's sort of there's an identity component
Well,
to
what I call it is
vehicle
a
ownership as well.
I call it a cultural identity
Cultural.
component. And I listen to my colleagues, and as an African American, I'm sorry, I disagree with them. I disagree with them because African Americans travel 15 to 25 miles more than the average white American in Ohio to get products. Many times in the African American community, we don't have stores or restaurants and things because of the lack of equity. So that when one talks about mass transit, when you're talking about extremely poor white communities and extremely poor Black communities, you have to look at the question that many of us travel many hours outside of our community to get to jobs, because those jobs don't exist in our community. So in an ideal world, mass transit would work if racial equity was real. And I think that it's very important to understand where we are and what racism looks like in the United States. And until we can look at equity of jobs and job creation, we're going to see people holding on to their automobile. And the thing that is very important to me on this is because when I look at EVs, I look at it differently than most people. I was in Cleveland about a year ago, and I went to a charger in the middle of Cleveland. It was an EVgo charger, and the charger was extremely old, and the cost was extremely high in the African American community. So I think to get to the dream of the future, we have to make sure that before we move away from cars, that we deal with driving or what we call range anxiety as EV folks, and that as we change this world, we have job creation that really begins to raise the level of single family households in the Black community and the Black community itself. So it's fine to create a future which is idealistic, but when you're dealing with racism and a lack of equity, we have to create a world which is real, where we're really based.
If I could pull that thread a little, I think so. Sort of the switch to EVs that you've described. Could you elaborate on some of like the other things that you think need to be happening concurrently, both to make that like financially viable for people or more financially viable than
I'd like to give you a perfect example. Let's say that you're a head of household in the city of Trotwood, where I live. I don't live in Cleveland. I live in Greater Miami Valley in Dayton. And let's say that you had decided that you wanted to send your kid to parochial school, and that's extremely expensive, right? And you're driving a regular gas automobile, which I agree we need to move to mass transit, but my actual cost of putting gas in my car ends up being $90 a day, right? Or $90 a week. If I can move somebody to something like a Volkswagen ID4, which Volkswagen is coming out with one for $30,000, the person, instead of spending $90 a week, we can charge a person's car and give them 300 miles of range for $11 a week. So what have we done? We've actually taken money that we can put into people's pockets so they can have food, so they can have clothes for the kids, so they can actually have a better quality of life. So not only am I concerned about air quality and protecting the world in which I live in, but I'm really immediately concerned about the whole question of equity and housing and creating a world where pollution, when we talk about pollution and these particular issues, they affect people of color and people in underserved communities at a higher level than anybody in the United States. And Ohio has the highest level of pollution in the nation, and it normally affects people of color first. So we have to be very practical with visions and look at things that can change our world. And once people feel that there's a level of equity, then we can begin to address some of those other issues.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Thank you. I wanted to maybe kick it over to Alex or Mandy if you had some kind of any other comments or responses to that, because I think it sounds like to Rap's point, in addition to the transition he's envisioning, there's some other societal implications that could also benefit medium term the mass transit side of things, at least in certain, certain contexts, like, the urban context of things, but I wanted to give you a chance to comment.
Yeah, so I think we like agree like on the whole idea that these climate change strategies have really got to address equity. And I think we have to do, all of it, right? But there's also like thinking about the relationship between all these different aspects of equity, like housing and placemaking and how you get around, they're all related. So, and the thing about investing in transit is it's also a way of investing in placemaking. And it's a way of really thinking about how can we create an environment that people want to invest in. So, like I said, I think we do need to think about both aspects of it, the transition to the zero emission vehicles, but also really we have this opportunity to think about, okay, so we know climate change is going to impact disadvantaged people the most. We know that, so that, the climate justice is really thinking about, well, how do we use those strategies to like fundamentally shift the way that the world operates so that we increase equity. And and the mode shift is kind of like a fundamental way of getting there. And I also think that, we have there's this idea out there, this vision of this cartopia, like if we can just make cars better. And this has really been talked about, like Peter Norton in his book, Autonorama, which I recommend, has really talked about how the car industry and the fossil fuel industry have really promoted this vision. Like if we can just get to that next technology, then we'll have this cartopia where we've got, no congestion, no pollution, and no people dying from the cars. It's totally safe. So, but in reality, like we haven't gotten there in decades, and we might not never get there, because fundamentally, cars have been used as a strategy for spreading people out, and segregation, and fundamentally just take up space in a way that makes it really hard to design cities around people instead of cars. So I think, we need to really consider that vision like critically, and is there a different vision that we can ultimately get to, that everybody, lots of people still will have cars, there'll still be the option for people to have cars, but other modes become more of an option. And what does that mean to our environment and our cities and our towns?
I think, and I'll kick it to Alex really quick for any additional comments. But one point I wanted to make is something that I've seen come up in a number of conversations with people who basically say, as much as I would like to maybe pivot to like a car light, or like a lifestyle, or a lifestyle that's interacting with cars differently, there are certain, even like in Cleveland, like certain day-to-day things that they say, this is what prohibits me from doing that. Sometimes it's like it's grocery runs. Sometimes it's very like carpool for multiple kids and things like that. And I think Rap, you commented on discrepancies in Black and white households and how far they have to go for goods, which I think is maybe subject to some of those same just day-to-day restrictions. And one thing I've seen that hasn't been really explored a lot, at least in Ohio, is the car sharing model, but not Uber and Lyft, but almost like going back to like the zip car model and having local access to vehicles where it's not a constant reliance, but a sometimes reliance as like a transitionary step. And I've seen them that is a good application for EVs, but I wanted to quickly give it to Alex, and then I do want to pivot to a question I have for Beth.
Okay, I'll try to tackle this
Yeah.
quickly. I think it all boils down to two competing views of how we deal with our transportation landscape. One is to accept the status quo and just try to, make a cartopia essentially. And the other is to sort of attack the root causes of why we have built this car-dominated world. The question of job access via transit has been debated endlessly in Cleveland in recent years. But the powers that be are typically looking at sort of what are these magical technological solutions we can come up with that will teleport people from poor Black neighborhoods to Solon, instead of really getting to the question of why is Eaton Corporation moving from downtown to the Chagrin Highlands? Why are we letting this happen? Why are they incentivized to do this? These are harder decisions. These are, you're going to rub people the wrong way. There's a lot of people that are not interested in changing the status quo. And I think that, I come down on the side of, I think that the negative impacts of cars, put aside all climate change considerations, the negative impacts to cars still is so immense that I do not want them to be dominating our dense living residential areas. They are, if you were to describe as somebody who'd never heard of a car, there's this machine that weighs 2,000 pounds, it can go 80 miles per hour at any time, and there's no restriction on this stuff. It's bonkers. I think that we need fewer cars. I think we need to, and the way that you get there is by consciously making decisions that encourage cities to be dense and walkable and not built for parking lots.
Thank you. I wanted to pivot the conversation a bit to some of the feedback I'm seeing in the chat. I've seen a lot of comments on trail and other, alternate infrastructure improvements. I think that feeds into the, the mode shift conversation that's been talked about, or in increasing the number of options people have for mobility applications. And I think I've seen e-bikes mentioned a couple of times, and I think the e-bike, sort of the e-bike revolution, in a lot of ways goes hand in hand with sort of the EV revolution, because you're seeing like a very traditional mode of transit evolve into something that is potentially more accessible for more people. But on the accessibility front, I wanted to kick this to Beth to see, do you see is there any synergy between any type of trail and other type of recreational or commute, cycling for commuting purposes, any type of synergy between that evolution and then the needs of the accessibility community with better pedestrian infrastructure, safer infrastructure and things? And do you see an opportunity there to increase access for people that maybe have non-standard mobility needs?
Yeah, so so what's interesting is, like, you're right, like as new paths are being put up, and like better bike paths mean bikes aren't on the sidewalks, and that makes them a bit safer for people with disabilities. One thing to think about too is, I know, earlier I kind of focused on people who use wheelchairs, but that, thinking about people with disabilities, it's a very large and diverse group of people. So thinking about the needs of people with hearing loss, people who have vision loss or blind, thinking about people who have anxiety or autism, and just making spaces that it's a lot to think about, spaces that work for all these different needs. The new trails and spaces, I know in the comments someone mentioned like the Red Line Greenway, like those spaces are really great and can be used by all people. Like one challenge that we encounter a lot, so a lot of the new, like the e-bikes and the scooters, I know some of the companies have been trying to develop accessible solutions as well that somebody could use that don't require standing or pedaling. I know Lime was working on some that they were going to pilot in Cleveland, but I don't think that's happened yet. But one challenge, I think, and an opportunity is while these things increase, it is an opportunity to talk about keeping spaces accessible and kind of addressing, there's a lot of inherent ableism in our culture, and we won't really talk about it, but something like, the scooters on the sidewalks, and I know Jonathan's heard me complain about them before, it's a big thing, but when they're left in a curb cut or in a sidewalk, and I've seen it, I'm a runner, and every day I go for a run, and I cannot go for a run in my neighborhood. I live in Ohio City in Cleveland without having to move a scooter out of the way at least once. And many people, again, who have disabilities, someone that's sitting in a wheelchair, a parent pushing a stroller, a person who's using a white cane, who's blind or has low vision, might not see that and can't move those vehicles out of the way. And so having those scooters there it creates a barrier. So it's an opportunity to start talking about people's behaviors and how we can contribute to keeping these spaces that we're designing for everyone, so everyone can use them. And it's the scooters. It's also things that we can just do in our regular lives, like businesses putting sandwich boards outside the door. That's keeping bikes, it's keeping scooters, it's keeping pedestrians from being able to use that sidewalk. It would be like if I just started putting all of my trash cans out in the street. And cars would have to drive around them. If people started doing that, it would be stopped immediately. And our sidewalks, that mode of transportation needs to be upheld and preserved and honored just as much as road safety is. So I think that's a really great opportunity there. And someone mentioned in the comments too, power wheelchairs as e-vehicles. That's a really good point. And I think it'd be really great if there were more opportunities for charging of power wheelchairs, power wheelchair charging stations, where you see, bike pumps. How cool would it be if there was also a place for somebody with a power wheelchair to charge their chair? That would be a really great opportunity to encourage, pedestrian travel for more people.
Yeah, the charging infrastructure expanded to other devices, I think, is a really good point that I actually don't know if I've ever heard explicitly brought up. But I know anecdotally I have been, in situations where someone's motor wheelchair has died, and they weren't able to get over snow while crossing Detroit Avenue, in front of the rapid station, and needed to push her up, the hill on West 101st there. And I think, I don't actually know any examples of where that charging infrastructure like that does exist. But Alex, I think I cut you off.
John, yeah, I'm sorry, I wanted to jump in and make a quick point. Is in all this discussion about scooters and other things that are on our sidewalks, just want to pose the question of why are these things on the sidewalks and not on the street? Why don't we park scooters on the street? And that's because, I think people are afraid of the reaction of car owners if on-street dedicated parking was to be removed for things for other people, more active uses. And this is just another part of the world that we've built that we need to fight against.
So I want to pivot a little bit, because there's a couple of different messaging streams that you've all provided. And I think in a lot of ways there might be some surface, there might be conflict, to a degree between some of the stances that you've all shared today. But I do think, for example, I think Alex, you and Rap both fundamentally, I think have a lot of shared, beliefs, especially with related to, the spatial mismatch between jobs and where people are living and how far people have to actually go to access things that they need. So one question I'd like to pose for all four of you is, as this dialogue evolves, and sooner rather than later, because I think has been conveyed, and within the climate context, we're sort of running out of time to implement improvements. But as this dialogue evolves, who specifically are communities that are critical to engage, and that maybe are currently being engaged, but also are not being engaged now? So specifically, kind of who needs to be looped into this conversation, in your opinion?
Can I say something to Alex? I think it's really important. I'm not pro cars, but the difference is that when people move to cities, 30 and 50 years ago, poor people and African Americans lived in cities. And as we had regentrification, we've moved African Americans and poor people out of cities into first and third tier suburbs. So if we move poor people out of cities and move well-to-do white people into cities, we were forced out of mass transit because it was destroyed by big oil and moved into cars. So I think it's very important that we have multimodal situations where, as an example, we can park our cars and charge them and get onto mass transit. But we need jobs in our communities so we can have them where we live, so that we can create our own cultural identities and deal with equity. And on your question, who needs to be addressed? I think we all need to be addressed because we're all citizens of the great state of Ohio. But I want to give you a story. In Trotwood, we did an event once where we brought African Americans together to talk about economic development. And the room was full of people. And the next discussion was, how do we evolve our city into a green state? And how do we save the planet? And the African Americans got up and left. Because historically, when you talk about mass transit and lack of cars and the whole question of the environment, we felt like we have not been partners. So it's very important, if we're going to have multimodal units where we benefit everybody, that we're active participants in the conversation, and that we're not afterthoughts, but you understand the particular things of racism that we've been dealing with for 450 years in the United States. And we often feel that as citizens, we're an afterthought in the conversation, not active participants.
Thank you for that. Those are good points and important points. If I could pass it off to Mandy, you're next on my screen.
Yeah, I think one of the communities we need to talk to are, the people who are right now riding transit. And I think that CPT does a really excellent job of engaging that community and is a really important voice that, RTA listens to. And, in that group of riders, we have to make sure that we reach out to the most disadvantaged riders. And, as far as engagement, more generally, I think that we really need to engage the business community around the importance of these issues and, try to help our business leadership create, a vision that includes these equity issues and includes an understanding of the importance of transit and walking and biking in creating a region that's economically competitive and provides both equity and quality of life for everyone. I also wanted to add, just on the point of connecting the chargers to transit, we are planning to do that. So we're working with both the Ohio EPA and NOACA to get funding to put private vehicle car chargers at several of our stations. And, that provides that opportunity for the EV owners to park and charge. And it could also facilitate car sharing down the road too. So the people who don't have their own cars can, use the transit network, and then at the ends of the network, use the electric vehicles to get to other places off the network that they need to go to. So we are definitely looking at that.
Great, thank you. Beth, I'll hand it off to you next.
Yes, so surprising no one, I think that people with disabilities across disability, need to be more involved in discussions around transportation. I know RTA has a great group, like advisory group of people with disabilities. And I know some people with disabilities who work with Clevelanders for Public Transit and other groups. And I think, you know, more of that and across the board, not just kind of focusing in one area, but in all aspects when we think about planning our communities, addressing, you know, I think, you know, as Rap mentioned, talking about communities and the people who have like constantly been ignored and disadvantaged, and it's always this reactionary thing. So changing that thinking and planning proactively from the beginning and not just reactionary, I think would be, you know, really helpful, and thinking in all spaces is important. A couple of weeks ago, ADA Cleveland had our first ever March for Access in Cleveland. And one of the things that people signed on to a letter to Mayor Bibb, but also to county officials and public officials throughout the area, looking for specific changes around transportation, you know, including more direct involvement by people with disabilities within the decisions that are being made across the board, from sidewalks to parking lots and public transit, but also, you know, the vehicle transportation issues as well. So I think just more people being involved, representing different areas and different interests and different needs across the board would be really is what we need to make these changes.
Thank you. Alex, you want to jump on that?
As a representative of a riders advocacy group, I think I'd be remiss to not say that the group that should be consulted on everything are public transit riders. I also think that there's kind of a mass belief in the idea that if we just consult enough people, we will find the perfect solution. And I don't think that is realistic in a lot of ways. There are some decisions that are just, you're not going to please everybody. And I think what we need is sort of the political will and the guts to do hard things. I wanted to talk a little bit about an interesting question of, you know, who do you consult? And I think one thing I want to throw out is this idea of, you know, consulting a group that doesn't exist, the idea of people who would like to live in an area but do not. So for example, University Circle, soon to be perhaps the largest jobs hub in the entire state. How many students, let's say, of the institutions of University Circle would like to live in the neighborhood and be able to walk to class and, you know, live within a short distance of their school, but instead, because rent in University Circle is very high, live in Cleveland Heights or somewhere else in the region and drive into University Circle, or, you know, are forced essentially to find some other way to get to class. This is a pretty large group of people that would love for there to be affordable places to live, for there to be more units of housing in University Circle. And, you know, they're not consulted on decisions because they're not a unit that is easily, you know, defined or grouped or even, you know, to speak to. You know, how do you speak to people that wish they live in University Circle? You know, you can't reach them. But I think that idea gets lost in almost all discussions of how we build a city, is that, you know, there are these groups of people that would want to be in a place, but when we're talking about, you know, how we're designing the streets and buildings and just laying out an area, they don't get to have a say because they're not easily, you know, they don't have a treasurer like myself or something like that. So that's something that I think is a rubric that I try to keep in mind for these kinds of decisions, and maybe some of you find that interesting as well.
Great, thank you. And we're coming up on the last 5 minutes. There are a lot of really good questions and comments in the chat. The one nice thing about this is because we're partnering with Black environmental leaders in FreshWater Cleveland, there is a follow-up piece being written about this discussion. And so we can incorporate questions and comments from the chat that we can't get to today into the development of that piece. So if we haven't directly addressed something you've provided to us in the chat, we are not ignoring you. So we will touch on that afterward. But I did, in the last 5 minutes, I wanted to kind of try to end on like an actionable note, because there is a sense of urgency around everything you've all shared. And so when talking with young people who are maybe they're entering the workforce, maybe they're trying to figure out what they want to do, what do they want to be advocates for? Basically just trying to figure things out. What do you see what do you see a need for in this space? So what can a young person go, what skills should they focus on? What type of opportunities should they seek out if they want to make a difference? I guess that's kind of not a great, I didn't really distill that point down very well, I'm sorry. But basically next steps, what should young people who want to care about this, what should they do? What is the next thing they should do? I guess think of like a late high school person if you need
Can I take it away from not being young people? Can I take it more to the point of what can people do?
Sure, that's fine. Yeah.
Because as I listen to my allies and colleagues here, I think that what we need in Ohio is more coalitions where we work together and begin to address the needs of what's affecting us as Ohioans. I think the first thing I hear when I talk to elected officials is, how do we address business? What does business want? And the thing that got us in this situation and this problem in the beginning is that we didn't listen to the people who were the workers and the minorities and the women, but we were listening to the profit makers. And that's what got us here. So before we start talking to what the businesses want, because what they want to do is make profit. What we need to do is build coalitions where we talk to the citizens of Ohio and make sure that the businesses begin to listen to us. So out of this conversation and listening to all of you, I don't disagree with many aspects. I just think that we're not talking to each other in many perspectives. And what we need to do for young people and women and minorities and people who are environmentalists in transportation is make sure that we're talking together and make sure the policies we make benefit all of us.
Great, thank you very much for that. Mandy. Beth, yes, Beth.
Oh, I just want to say like real quick, because I had similar thoughts with rap, and I think really important thing, especially for young kids before they have a habit of not paying attention, is building the habit of just paying attention, looking around. So many of the things that we've talked about, like whether it like from like the priorities of our streets, the lack of access on our sidewalks, how our actions impact safety of our streets and sidewalks, and the options in our public transit, like things that we do as individual people impact all of that. And our voices in these conversations impact all of that. And I think just paying attention and building that habit of looking at who's around, how are people using transportation, who's driving these cars. Like I remember shortly after moving to my neighborhood, seeing somebody and I see it often now, but it was the first time I saw somebody take a taxi to the grocery store. And thinking about that and thinking about why that's happening and if that's a good thing or a bad thing and how that impacts their ability to pay for their groceries and their rent, and just paying attention to that and other people's experiences, I think is a really important step to building the collaborations and the coalitions that I agree are really important and necessary.
Great, thank you very much. Mandy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I would totally agree with all of that, and just add that there are, opportunities to get involved in planning initiatives, which I don't think, necessarily hear enough from young people. Like, for example, NOACA right now has several opportunities coming up to get involved. They're doing a regional climate change plan, and they need to I think, hear the input of young people. And then they also have a program called Street Supplies, where you can actually plan a project in your neighborhood, get some paint and delineators, and make some traffic calming improvements. And work with organizations like Bike Cleveland and CPT to start getting engaged in those kinds of projects. I think that is a really neat opportunity that it would be great to get more young people involved in.
Thank you very much. Alex.
So I think the first way to get involved would be to join CPT. Seriously, getting involved with a direct action group is, I think, a great way to start out, or to scratch that itch. I'll just say CPT's next general meeting is Saturday, October 22nd, 10:30 a.m. at the main branch of the public library downtown. Very easy to reach via transit or bike. I will also say, just to change things up a little bit, for, let's say, the target audience of someone of high school age, if you're really serious about like these kinds of transportation infrastructure things, and you want to make a career, a life of this, I would say oftentimes that translates going to planning school. And no offense to my fellow planners out there, I would say go to engineering school. There is a serious need for sort of progressive-minded civil engineers. So much of our built environment is coming from the hands of engineers. And, there's a very, in Cleveland, we see this all the time, an old school mindset of what safe streets look like, or what transit infrastructure should look like, really sets you back. And so this is just sort of a wacky answer, but if you're really serious and you're, trying to set the course of your life, it's something to consider. Advice I wish someone had given me when I was that age, because, who knows, but I'll just leave it at that.
No, I appreciate the shout out to the significance of civil engineers in shaping the day-to-day existence of everybody. So no, great advice. Thank you. Yeah, I want to just thank you all again for joining us today. As I mentioned, there will be a follow-up piece on this. So any points we haven't, resolved yet, or open conversation still, we're able to continue those into that piece. And again, there are a lot of really good bits of information that have been left in the chat. So we do have a record of all that, all these links, all these references, names, and everything. So we will be retaining those going forward. So thank you very much for all the information that other attendees have shared in the chat. We really, really greatly appreciate that. But it is 7:03, so I don't want to hold people too late for time. So thank you very much. This was our first return to this series for Global Shapers. So thank you all for joining. And then Elena, Courtney, do you want to give a pitch for our next one?
Yeah, so I'm sharing my screen right now for you all, so hopefully you can see. Courtney's putting in the chat ways to stay engaged with us on these topics. So all of the dates here, they're always on Thursdays from 6 to 7 on Zoom. We'll be recording them to post on our YouTube, but you'll sign up via Eventbrite just like you did for this event tonight. Again, the conversation will be with experts in our region and across the state, moderated by a global shaper. So these are the remaining topics we have lined up. And yeah, there is also the FreshWater Cleveland articles that you can follow under the tag environmental justice. And that's really all I wanted to share. I did want to say, for folks that want to stay on and maybe ask some shapers questions, we have this Zoom till 7:30. So we'll stop recording, but I will be on just to, chat with